The first time that I became aware of Seamus Heaney's poetry, I think I was about 18 years old, and I read a poem of his called The Beaches, and it was about him as a small boy high up on a tree, hearing everything below from the village. And there was one line in it where he says that he could hear a lorry changing gear from about 3 miles away, and he knew who was driving the lorry. And this was astounding for me because the experience that I had as a young boy, I was up at the top of a horse chestnut tree and I could hear a lorry changing gear from 3 miles away, and I knew who was driving the lorry. So it was extraordinary for me that a poem could do this. I'd never read a poem before or heard a poem read that I could relate to in such a way, a physical way, I think. And I met Seamus Heaney in Derry in the late, I think it was about 1994, and I told him about the poem, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember that." And I said, I've written a poem for you, Seamus." And he said, "Okay, thank you very much." And I said, "I don't have it with me, but I'll send it to you." So I did, and I got a postcard back from him saying, "This is a wonderful poem, and thank you very much." And he said, "I am too old now to climb the chestnut trees." He said, "But you keep climbing, boy." And I have the postcard. It's a precious little bit of a memorabilia that I have. This is the poem that I wrote because of that poem. It's called Heaney Among the Trees. With that gear shift, he lifted me then, in the trees high above Derry Loran. I could hear and see the lorry. No man before had put me so firmly in my place, told me who I was and where I was from. Forgotten days, remembered for me whether I wanted them or not. The distant unfamiliar hum at the very top of the horse chestnut. One slip and I was gone. The danger of going as far as I could. My father saying, "You always go too far, boy." But to look at the familiar from a dangerous place, that's what I was striving for. That's why Heaney was always among the trees, to get a sense of what it is we are, what it is we really want, what it is we love, to grab on for dear life, to go further up and up and up, one foot after the other, to sit then in the silence of ourselves with everything beneath us. One slip and we're gone. I've been writing poetry, I think, ever since then, ever since I was 18, and I started really in a pub called the Adam's Arms in London, and there was a poetry organisation called the Apples and Snakes, and they had an evening of poetry called Poems for Pints, which really appealed to me at the time because I used to drink quite heavily. And so you would go along, you would read 3 of your own poems, and you would get 3 free pints of beer. So that's how I started. Alcohol was very much involved in the beginnings of my poetry. And then I decided that I needed to perform the poems, because I used to go along and see poets reading, and these were sort of famous poets, but it seemed to me that they couldn't really perform their poetry properly, and I don't think they did their own poems justice, because they would read down here and they were mumbling and you couldn't hear them. And so I became very aware that I had to actually perform these poems, and that's when the whole performance poetry thing, came into being in the 1980s, the late 1980s, and that's where I started. And then there was a particular night where I forgot all my poems. I left them on the tube, and I was doing a little place called the Archway Tavern in North London, and I arrived without any poetry, so I just had to talk about poetry, and I had to tell a few jokes. And 2 weeks later I saw an ad in the paper which said, not an ad, but a listing in the paper which said, Owen O'Neill, stand-up comedian. And I thought, oh really? Okay. And that's how I get into stand-up comedy, through poetry. What else can I say? Why bother writing? That is a big question. I think that I feel that I don't have a choice in the matter. I feel that I'm being nagged from somewhere to write, and I don't know where that's from, or what the need that is. I think it's a very sort of a deep. It's a deep thing, isn't it? It's you know, why do you want to write? Why do you want to do anything? Why do you want to play music, or eat, or run, or, you know, do any of those things? I think it's sort of part of trying to make sense of the world, trying to make sense of your feelings, trying to relate to other people, your feelings. I'm not big into poetry that I have to really sit down and think about for hours and hours on end. That's not the kind of poetry that... I mean, I think there's room for that poetry, but I think for me, poetry has to hit me here. I have to, when I read a poem, it has to be uplifting, or it has to make me sad. It has to be some kind of emotional impact with a poem. Otherwise, what's the point of it, really?
How do you know a poem is started? What is the feeling you get?
I suppose it's like jumping off a cliff. It's like, you know, being in an airplane. I don't know if you've ever done, if anybody's ever done a parachute jump, but it's just before you do the parachute jump, that's like, I'm just about to write a poem now, and then when you start writing it, you're out of the plane, and you're just, you know, you're plummeting towards the ground. And I think that's the way I feel when I'm writing poetry. Yeah, it's you just have to make that jump, and you know, there isn't anything that you can do. I don't like to start. Every time I start a poem, I always end it. Oddly enough, I know a lot of other poets, and they write and they stop halfway through, or they can't get it, or they go back, or they scrap it. I think that's rare for me. When I get an idea for a poem, or it's like an emotion, and it drives you, and you got to write it down. It's like you got to tell somebody something. If you see something, if you see a movie, or you see something, and you got to get home and tell your wife, I can't believe what I saw today. That's, I think, where poetry for me comes from. I have to tell people about it, and, you know, hopefully they'll find it interesting. Yeah, you know, I came from a family of, there was 16 of us, 8 boys and 8 girls, and, you know, it was hard to get your own space in a house like that. And I remember when I came to England the first time, and I was, you know, talking to this girl, and she told me, she said, you know, I had an imaginary friend when she was an only child, and she had an imaginary friend, and her mother used to, you know, put out the plate for the imaginary friend, and the glass, and the knife and the fork, and that made me laugh so much when I was about 18 years old. I thought that was absolutely hilarious, because I had the opposite of that. I used to sit and try to think that I was on my own. There wasn't anybody there. So I think I was quite, I didn't come from a house where there was a lot of books as such, but we did go to the pictures quite a bit on a Saturday, and that's where I used to escape into film. And I loved I mean, I saw some fantastic films, like, I mean, they weren't for children, really. I don't know, I can't remember now. I mean, I saw movies like The Grapes of Wrath, I was stunned by that. I was only about 12. And then, of course, I got the book, and the book is even 10 times better. So I think my imagination was fired by the movies when I was a kid, yeah. When I was 9 years old, I was stealing apples from the nun's orchard in the village where I came from in County Tyrone, and I was 9 years old, and I was struck by lightning. And the lightning hit the tree, and then it came off, and it hit me, and my hair was actually on fire. The back of my head was on fire. I was flung out of the tree onto my back, and my hands and feet were scorched. And I got home, and my father, I mean, I come from quite a a strong sort of Catholic background, and it was actually my grandfather who was convinced that it was divine intervention and that I'd been struck down because of the apple scenario. But it had a profound effect on me in that it made me think that I was indestructible for quite a number of years. And also I was quite fearless as a teenager. And I think it made me write a lot as well. I mean, I do actually have a poem called Struck by Lightning. It's a long poem, I won't read it today, but yeah, I think it's a traumatic thing to happen to anyone. But I think in the long run, I'm glad it happened. Really, I'm really glad it happened, because I think it kind of made me who I am today. I think being struck by lightning in an odd kind of way.